ladies and gentlemen, Crush.
Is my mic working? Yeah, all right. Got it working. Whew. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, First Ascents, and thank you to everyone in this room. This is just the most incredible family that I could ever ask for, and I think we're all so lucky to be here tonight. So this is my story. Before I was diagnosed with cancer, my husband and I had a habit of pointing out how lucky we were. As we approached our 30th birthdays, we had been together and in love for nearly a decade. His career in counseling and mine in international development were on the rise and allowed us to afford our own home in the mostly unaffordable downtown Washington, D.C. We had fallen in love with an incredible community of friends, as you could see, who loved us with their whole hearts. We had an ever-expanding family who supported us completely, and we had big dreams to travel the world, move someplace beautiful, and start a family, and we had no reason to think that they wouldn't come true. Then just a few months after my 30th birthday, I found it, a golf ball-sized lump in my right breast. I saw a doctor a few days later who sent me to a breast center. And at 30 years old, in the same month my husband and I had planned to start trying for a family, I found myself alone in a hospital gown, waiting with women twice my age to get my first mammogram. The rest of the day was a whirlwind. By that afternoon, I had gotten not just a mammogram, but an ultrasound and a biopsy. I'd been assigned a nurse navigator, and I had an appointment set up with a breast surgeon. 5 days later, I was diagnosed with stage 2 triple-negative breast cancer. Over the next few weeks, I had more tests and scans than I even knew existed. I went through fertility treatments to have my embryos frozen. I stood up in my best friend's wedding, and I started chemo. As I got used to the ups and downs of chemo, I gave the days of the week new names, like Feel Shitty Sundays and Feel Good Wednesdays. On Feel Good days, I would exercise and see my friends and go to work and try to pretend like my life was normal. When my hair began to fall out, I was totally prepared with an assortment of colorful head wraps and dangly earrings. I blogged through all of it, writing pieces like An Ode to My Hair, in which I apologized for every bad hair day I had ever complained about. Or Future Baby Mama Drama, in which I described the herring trials of fertility treatment. Slowly but surely, the Feel Shitty days began to feel even worse and started rolling over into the Feel Good days. I got super tired of the seemingly endless assault on my body. Within just a few months, I'd been to the ER for what appeared to be but was not a heart attack. I got a full body rash so horrifically itchy that the only relief was to sleep covered in ice packs. And I swung violently into menopause, making me want to apologize for every crazy look I'd ever given a sweaty middle-aged woman. In the 4th month, I started on an extremely toxic chemo, adriamycin Cytoxan, for those who know what I'm talking about, that made me sicker than I'd ever been before. For several days after each treatment, I was too weak to even walk. My mouth and throat stung with sores that were inches long. My eyes burned, my stomach ached incessantly, my head throbbed. I basically felt like I was dying, all but a handful of days, for 8 straight weeks. It was around that time that my brain just completely and utterly broke. I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. I no longer recognized my life. I had little to look forward to besides surgery, radiation, and eventually the fear of recurrence. Chemo was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and no one in my life could relate. I got looks and texts and cards that were overflowed with pity. I had gone from capable, compassionate go-getter with my whole life ahead of me to a weak and angry and miserable soul with a future already scarred with fear. I started to experience symptoms of PTSD, which research has finally recognized as a very real side effect of cancer and cancer treatments. My brain, my life, and my future all felt broken. Fortunately, I survived those 5 months and 16 rounds of chemo. To celebrate, my friends and I threw a dance party in which I wore the first and only wig I ever owned, a short bob in neon pink. Good, yeah. It was a good one. It was like $9 on Amazon. A few weeks later, I had a double mastectomy. It was during this surgery that they discovered that all that chemo I had been on had very little impact on the tumor, and the cancer had already spread to nearby lymph nodes. As I was recovering from surgery, I got a call from Wildflower at First Descents. I had signed up a few months earlier after my friend and personal hero, Huck, or Yings, as some of you may know her, told me about her rock climbing trip. Despite the fact that I had just had my entire chest cut open and couldn't lift my hands higher than my shoulders, I was determined to go rock climbing. I booked a trip to Moab, Utah for later that year, giving myself a few months to recover from treatments. A few weeks later, I went for a routine follow-up with my medical oncologist and discovered that because the first 5 months of chemo had been ineffective, that they wanted me to have 3 more months before beginning radiation. Naturally, I collapsed in her office, sobbing at the prospect. I was told I could think it over, and when I went home that day, I felt as close to suicidal as I have ever been in my entire life. It was ironic because I wanted nothing more than to survive, but I did not want to survive this way. In that moment, I just wanted out of my life. I held on to a bottle of narcotics for comfort for nearly an hour before my husband made me call a prevention hotline, and I made the gut-wrenching decision to get more chemo. 3 long months later, I celebrated yet again, but this time I sat on a beach in the Caribbean for a week before I returned to start 5 grueling weeks of radiation. I spent the morning of my last radiation treatment feeling triumphant. But over the course of the day, my exuberance quietly turned into a foreboding fear. For a year, I had been in treatments to fight my cancer. Now, I was alone. I also didn't really know who I was anymore outside of cancer. The Katie I had once been was forever gone and was replaced by someone who was, yes, tough as nails, but also bitter and confused and afraid. I told my husband that the only future I could imagine was one in which cancer eventually took my life. It had already taken so much from me, it just seemed like the only logical conclusion. Fortunately, Wildflower and others had encouraged me to not postpone my trip with First Descents, even though the extra chemo meant I was now leaving just 2 weeks after treatment ended. I arrived in Utah a ball of nervous energy, but that quickly dissipated as I sat down to my first evening with my fellow fighters and survivors. We turned to stories of surgeries and chemo brain and weird pooping episodes for small talk, the way most people turn to the weather. We were all desperate for understanding. For people our own age, with their own chemo, radiation, surgery, doctors, pain, near-death, fake boobs, hair loss, menopause experiences, I knew immediately that I had found my tribe. Out on the rock the first day, I was again nervous. For a year, I'd been the weakest person in the room, and I really didn't want to be that person anymore. I was pleasantly surprised after my first few climbs when I seemed to have some semblance of strength. But it was on the second day that I met my greatest foe of the week. I had jumped at the chance to take on what seemed like a pretty difficult climb, but about 10 feet short of the top, I could feel my strength fading fast. It had been an excruciating climb, and my muscles were just completely spent. I'd been clawing and grasping and dragging myself up, fighting for every inch, and yeah, this is that exact moment. Every time I thought I might have to throw in the towel, I heard a chorus of support screaming at me from above and below, unwilling to let me stop fighting. I took a moment and thought about all the pain I'd endured against my will over the last year. If I could survive that pain, I could survive this pain, I thought to myself, and finally pushed myself far enough to reach the last hold, a nice big jug, and hoisted myself up. It was in that moment that I truly became Crush. Katie had been cancer's victim. Crush was a fighter, a life embracer, tough as nails, but also optimistic as hell about the adventures that life had in store. My life suddenly felt big and rich and full of possibility. I spent the rest of that fall on one adventure after another. I spent a weekend wandering the streets of Rome, cheating on my diet with pizza and cappuccinos. I dove with seals and great white sharks in South Africa. I snorkeled with sea turtles in Mexico. I was determined to see as much as I could and really embody what it meant to be out living it. I also joined the DC-Baltimore Tributary, a group of First Ascents alumni in my hometown, and immediately found in them a family of fellow adventure seekers and cancer crushers. I envisioned that fall as my cancer victory lap, but little did I know that cancer had much more in store for me. A few months after my First Ascents trip in January of last year, I found yet another lump, this time near my collarbone. Within a few weeks, it was confirmed that the cancer was back and had spread to a more distant lymph node. My doctor told me it was now stage 4. She also told me that it was chemo-resistant, and it was radiation-resistant, and it was inoperable, and unless it grew bigger or spread to my organs, that I didn't qualify for any clinical trials. There was literally nothing they could do. I had a 1-centimeter tumor in my lymph node, and I was being told that it would very likely end my life. Unwilling to let that be the final answer, I started a whirlwind tour and saw 16 different oncologists at 9 of the nation's best hospitals over the next 2 months. They all delivered the exact same news. There was nothing they could do. Just give it a few months, it'll spread quickly. Try to enjoy the time you've got, one doctor told me. I was sad, and I was scared, and I was desperate. My husband and I spent long nights holding on to one another, grieving the children that we would never have, the vacations we would never take, and the anniversaries that we would never celebrate. But even in the midst of such great despair, I knew I was not ready to throw in the towel. So I kept searching, and eventually my good friend Coconuts from my First Ascents trip put me in touch with her doctor, an independent oncologist in New York City. He had a completely different approach to cancer, and unlike all of the other doctors, believed I actually had a fighting chance. He put me on a protocol that included multiple treatments, many of them cutting-edge, off-label immunotherapies with few side effects. Of course, being outside the system now meant we had to pay out of pocket for everything, but when we turned to our community of supporters for help, they stepped up like never before. After months of taking dozens of pills every day, getting injections every month, and completely transforming my diet, the scans began to confirm what my doctor believed was possible, and the tumor started melting away. For 9 months, my cancer was slowly but surely shrinking, until last November when scans showed it had popped up in additional lymph nodes. This time, I was afraid, but I was not despairing. I had hoped to one day be rid of my cancer, but with the progression, it finally occurred to me that my cancer may never be gone. I may never stop paying for these insanely expensive treatments. I may never get to be the mom that I had always dreamed of being. I may not make it to 60 or 50 or even 40. And while these prospects are both terrifying and heartbreaking, they are my reality. And so I did the only thing that I could. I dug in deep to all the difficult places and battled it out with feelings of fear and grief and my own self-worth. Slowly but surely, I began to find a place of acceptance. If I couldn't have a life without cancer now or possibly ever, then I would live this life now with cancer and with all of the love, acceptance, and peace that I could muster. Today, I continue my treatments, and I've added a few more promising ones. I am still a believer in both miracles and medicine, and I will always hold out hope that one or the other, or a little bit of both, will help me remain on this earth for a very long time. 14 months ago, I was given 13 months to live, and as you can see, I am still very much alive. But for me, it was not the doctors or the treatments that have given me a second shot at life. It was first ascents. It was not bravery forged in an infusion center or a hospital bed, but bravery forged out on that rock that has gotten me this far. You see, the rock never promises to go easy on you. You will suffer your fair share of sore muscles, bruises, and cuts. But it does guarantee you an adventure, an exploration of yourself and the limits of your determination, and if you're on the right path, a beautiful view at the top. And whenever you feel like you might fall, you'll discover that there's always someone there already holding you up. When you want to give up, there's a course of support cheering you on. In short, First Ascents has not just taught me how to live, but how much there is to live for. In doing so, First Ascents has already saved my life. Outliving it has become my cure. So that someday, when I eventually die, whether that be in 5 or 50 years, I will, as someone once said, look back on this and smile, because it was life, and I decided to live it. Thank you.